So if you were with us last time, you found out that the protests that we had staged, we being the American colonists, in the 1760s had ultimately succeeded in getting Britain to repeal the laws that they had implemented with respect to taxation. Now, two things before I move forward. First of all, you know that the reason that the American colonists had a problem with this taxation had less to do with money and more to do with the principle. The principle was they weren't giving us any representatives over in Parliament, and therefore we considered that to be an illegal tax and illegal law. Keep in mind, the Enlightenment had really helped to shape American political thought, and John Locke's notions of government deriving its power from the people really went a long way with American colonists during this time period. So a couple things. This protest movement succeeded in getting Britain to repeal the Townshend Acts. Remember those acts we were talking about? Tax on consumer items, things of that sort. But they do respond. It's not as if Britain just simply gives up on this whole thing. They do respond, and we'll talk about how they respond in just a minute. The second thing that I'd like you to be mindful of is by 1771, in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre, one of the things that you saw started popping up, especially around the Boston area, Massachusetts generally speaking, would be these town committees. Now, town committees was a really polite way of saying militia. Really what you're talking about are people that, they obviously talk a really good game when it comes to why the British should not be doing whatever it is that they're doing. But these are individuals that are also discussing independence, they're discussing fighting the British. And at the helm of these town committees is our good friend Samuel Adams. Now, you'll know Samuel Adams as one of the key leaders in the Sons of Liberty. He's a guy that's, you'd call him a millionaire in this day and age. But he's very instrumental in providing guidance and, in some instances, economic resources for the Sons of Liberty. And so, my point with this is, by 1771, neither side's budging in Massachusetts, and in particular Boston. Bostonians have drawn a red line in the sand, and as you'll see in due time, one of the things that the British are going to do is send troops to actually occupy the city of Boston. Okay, so all of this leads us into 1773 and the establishment of the Tea Act. Okay, now you're going to have to pay close attention to me on this because it can get kind of confusing. The Tea Act was designed to save a British company, the East India Tea Company. Now, by 1773, the East India Tea Company was going broke, and one of the primary reasons it was going broke is American colonists were not buying its tea. Think back to my discussion on mercantilism. The point of mercantilism was to keep British money in British hands, grow the economy from the inside out. So if you're a British citizen, technically the only kind of tea that you should be buying would be British East India tea. We didn't, because there was a tax associated with it. And we felt to pay the tax would be to acknowledge that Britain had the right to tax us, and of course we didn't feel that they had the right to tax us. So for years and years we had not bought their tea, and as a consequence it was going broke. What the Tea Act of 1773 did was it suspended the import duty associated with British East India tea. Now, don't get this wrong. It does not suspend the actual tax that American colonists would be paying. It's simply telling the company, the East India Tea Company, you don't have to pay taxes for the privilege of doing business in the Americas. It's going to make your tea cheaper, and consequently it's going to make it more attractive in the eyes of American colonists. And you would really ask yourself, why? Why would a group of people get so up in arms, create such a fuss, simply because the price of a key commodity like tea went down? The British government assumed that this was about the dollars and cents of everything, that this was about, us not wanting to have a raise in living, a cost of living adjustment. It wasn't. It was about the principle of no taxation without representation. Now, the Sons of Liberty in places like Boston were furious at this because, naturally, most people who are not reading, newspapers in Boston or newspapers in Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, most people are simply going to buy the tea that makes most economic sense to them. If you've got two similar products and, one's cheaper than the other, Gas is a really good example in our day and age. You know, I don't think that too many of you are really brand loyal when it comes to what kind of gasoline you're putting in your car. And so the Sons of Liberty were really upset about this because they could see the British East India Tea Company doing well by this, and by them doing well would be us, in essence, acknowledging that they really did have a right to tax us, which of course we did not believe they did. Because keep in mind, although it suspended the import duties, the taxes for the company, it did not suspend the tax that consumers, American colonists, would be paying. So to vent their frustrations, what you see happen is a group of Sons of Liberty dressed themselves up as Mohawk Indians. They boarded one of these merchant ships, which you need to understand is official king's property. It's the property of the British government. And they dumped what would have been worth close to $1 million of tea into the Boston Harbor. Now you know this as the Boston Tea Party. It was a protest that you will not tax us without our consent, okay? It was also illegal. I mean, it goes beyond vandalism. I mean, in this day and age, you'd probably call it theft. Whatever the case was, the British government responded quite harshly, understandably so, but very harshly. Now, one of the reasons I'm pausing here is I need you to understand not everybody agreed with what the Sons of Liberty had done at the Boston Tea Party. There are a lot of people with raised eyebrows that said, whoa, that's kind of radical, even if it's directed at the British. The problem that the British government had was it really kind of made Bostonians a rallying cry. How did that happen? Well, the government responded by issuing something called the Coercive Acts. Now think about the word coercive. What does that word mean? It means to force, the forceful acts. Force of what? Well, force American colonists to acknowledge that Britain had the right to tax them. Acknowledge that British law is supreme. To do that, it took a number of different measures to get Bostonians in particular to acknowledge that the British were in charge, including the Port Bill. This was the first aspect of the Coercive Acts. What the Port Bill did was it simply closed down Boston Harbor. It said, look, if you want to act like children, then we'll treat you like children. If you can't be trusted to play in the harbor, you're not going to have a harbor. So it shut down the Boston Harbor. The Quartering Act, this was a new one, all right? Bostonians would be forced to build additional barracks for British soldiers. We've already talked about why British soldiers weren't very popular in the first place, but the British government said, look, clearly we need a more forceful police force out there. You've demonstrated that personally, and they've got to stay somewhere. So a new Quartering Act. The Justice Act. We've talked about how writs of assistance and jumping on board an American merchant vessel and seizing its property was a really big deal to a lot of these people like John Hancock. What the Justice Act said is, if we catch you smuggling in black market illegal products, whatever the case may be, you are going on trial, but you're not going on trial in Boston. You're going on trial in London. You're going on trial in Jamaica or somewhere else within the British Empire, where a British judge and jury are going to be far more likely to throw the book at you. Lastly, the Quebec Act. Now, think about Quebec. It's a former French colony taken over by the English. From a religiosity standpoint, the French are generally Catholic, right? All the Quebec Act said was people in the former French colony of Quebec would be allowed to continue to practice Roman Catholicism. It really didn't say anything about the American colonists, and why it was bundled into the Coercive Acts is a little bit confusing. But nonetheless, the Quebec Act simply says Catholicism will be tolerated in the former French colony. Well, Bostonians interpreted that to mean the king is trying to force Catholicism on all of us, and clearly that will not be tolerated. So taken together, the Coercive Acts were not called the Coercive Acts by Bostonians, and later on they were not called the Coercive Acts by Pennsylvanians or Georgians or South Carolinians or New Yorkers. They were called the Intolerable Acts because most Americans found them to be simply intolerable. Now, what happens is you see another meeting of the minds. You see the establishment of the Continental Congress. Okay? And again, like Albany, like the Stamp Act Congress, we're getting together as a group of Americans, not just people from Massachusetts or New York, but everybody. And we're beginning to discuss what should be done vis-a-vis the intolerable acts. Now, what the king does not realize at this time is there's a lot of divisions within the ranks. You had people like John Adams, who the gauntlet had already been thrown down in his mind, and we needed to declare war yesterday and figure out the rest tomorrow. But you also had pragmatic-minded individuals like Joseph Galloway, who understood that declaring war would essentially be challenging the most powerful country in the history of mankind to that point, and that might not be the best idea. So people like Galloway from Pennsylvania, they wanted a political solution. They wanted, a peaceful solution to all of this. Okay? Well, the long and short of it is troops are sent to basically occupy the city of Boston, and when that happened, taken in combination with the coercive nature of the Coercive Acts, by 1774, most Americans sided with the Patriot movement. Most Americans began warming up to the idea that something dramatic needed to be done with respect to what the British were doing to us. Let me give you a quick example. In 1774, there was a guy from New Hampshire, a guy by the name of Governor Benning Wentworth, who started this organization called the Tory Association. Now, if you were a Tory back during this period, it meant that you were a British loyalist. It meant that you not only did not want to rebel against the government, but you felt it was illegal, it was treasonous to do so. So Wentworth puts together this Tory Association, and it fetches, that is, a whopping 63 members. Out of all of New Hampshire, 63 people said, okay, I will sign up for your organization. Of those 63, 59, at least 59, were blood relatives. What does that tell you about the Tory movement? Well, what it tells me is most Americans are siding on behalf of the Patriots. Most Americans see the British as the aggressor, and more importantly, most Americans are beginning to see that something really dramatic does need to be done with respect to what Britain is doing to us. So compromise is failing. That's the long and short of this. And in the wake of that failure, one of the institutions that you begin to see rise is something called the Minutemen. They're exactly what they sound like they are, right? These guys are basically amateur soldiers who have guns and ammunition at their ready, and at a moment's notice they can be out in the streets, Concord, Lexington, Boston, ready to do battle with the British. So the Minutemen are basically amateur soldiers that are preparing for inevitable war with the British. Now, as a response to all of this, one of the things that the government does is it sends in the main commander of the British military at the time, a guy by the name of General Thomas Gage. Now, it's Gage that's occupying the city of Boston. Now, in addition to policing the streets of Boston, one of the other things that Gage has been commissioned to do is to seize an ammunitions cache in Concord, on the outskirts of Boston. It's not that far, but, it's on the outskirts of town. So anyway, what Gage decides to do is to march a good chunk of his army inland, westward, toward the interior of Massachusetts, toward Concord. And the whole point is to really do two things, but to seize these guns and also to arrest John Hancock. Do you remember me talking about Paul Revere? We've talked about him here and there, his involvement in the Masons, and certainly his involvement in the propaganda of the Boston Massacre. What Paul Revere is probably most famous for is his midnight rides, okay? The British are coming, the British are coming. There's a lot of things that are wrong with that statement, and let me begin with the word the British. At that particular moment, there were people that were kind of confused about who they were or what all this revolutionary talk meant. So when it comes to yelling, the British are coming, he would never have said the British, because that would have been like me or you going through the streets of, Dallas and saying, the Americans are coming, the Americans are coming. It wouldn't have made any sense to anybody. So what Revere said was, the regulars are coming, the regulars are coming. And he certainly didn't scream it, because everything had to be kept on the down low, because he's trying to warn John Hancock to get out of Dodge. And he's also trying to warn all these Minutemen that they better protect their weapons, okay? And so he's riding relatively quietly through the streets of Boston, and Massachusetts generally speaking, and he's also trying to signal anybody within the area. What he can't reach within earshot, he's trying to signal. And if the British were coming by land, he'd held up one lantern while he was riding on his horse. And if they were coming by sea, 2 lanterns. So what Paul Revere is doing is basically sounding the 18th century alarm, right? That you need to be out in the streets and you need to prepare for war. Well, as they were marching through Lexington, Massachusetts on their way to Concord, Revere's midnight ride woke up a lot of sleepy Minutemen, some of whom were at the pub and some of whom were not. And to find out what all the fuss was about, they made their way out into the streets, and what they saw was this British army that was on the march. And of course, insults were hurled back and forth, and what the British are telling them is, disperse, disperse, you damn rebels, and go home. You have no business here. This is official British government business, okay? As you might imagine, there was some confusion that resulted in this. A shot broke out, a shot that's referred to as the shot heard round the world. And what this does is it really serves as a rallying point that gets people to, the floodgates open. That's what I'm trying to say. The floodgates open with respect to Minutemen pouring out into the streets getting ready to do business, or to do battle with the British, okay? So by the time that the British actually made it to Concord to try to confiscate these weapons, there's a lot of Minutemen out there now. It's not so easy to just kind of take what you came for. And furthermore, to get that, they had to cross this bridge. And if you've ever seen the film 300, the Battle of Thermopylae, right, part of the reason that the Spartans were so successful against the ancient Persians was the Persians had to, get through this very narrow passageway. And although there only were 300 Spartan warriors, it was pretty easy to, hit these guys as sitting ducks when they're trying to make their way through this narrow passage. Well, the same thing is absolutely true with the British trying to cross this bridge. They're basically having target practice played upon them, okay? So anyway, General Gage starts out with his whole army intact, and they limp back. They forget about trying to seize these weapons, let alone arrest Hancock. They limp all the way back to Boston with major, major casualties, okay? So this was the quote-unquote battles of Lexington and Concord. These are kind of preliminary battles. They're battles that take place before the Declaration of Independence is actually issued, but they're really seen as the opening moves with respect to the American Revolution. Again, this prompts a second meeting of the Continental Congress, another time that we're all getting together and we're saying, I know that you're from South Carolina and you're from Georgia and you're from New York, but, we've got this common problem and what is to be done about it? And so one of the things that they said should be done is Major George Washington should be allowed to draft an army, the Continental Army, and lead it. Why Washington? Well, he was one of the only men in the continent at the time that actually had some formal military training, and he had a lot of experience, as we pointed out, in the French-Indian War. But even more important than that was the publication of a pamphlet known as Common Sense, okay? Now, Common Sense was written by a guy by the name of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was a former employee of the British ministry. He was essentially an accountant in the British Treasury who had been fired, so he was disgruntled. He had a bone to pick with the British government, and he emigrated into the American colonies around about this time, and taken together that he was pretty upset with the British government to begin with, and he was swept up with all of this revolutionary sentiment at the time. What he does is he publishes one of the most important documents of the pre-revolutionary period. Common Sense provided a rationale, an explanation, what we're doing or why we're doing what we're doing, kind of, description, not to the John Adams and the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons of the day. It was written without those $10 political science words. It was written in language that just about anybody could understand. And so it was read at the pub, it was read at these town committees, it was read widely throughout the colonies, not just in Massachusetts, but elsewhere too. And what this does is it really galvanizes, it really unifies this patriot movement. And so by 1775, we're very, very close to declaring our independence. Okay? Now, in the spring of 1776, there were a lot of meetings of the minds, so to speak. The Continental Congress was sending people like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin to these meetings to, decide whether or not we should rebel. And, up until this point, rebellion was at least maybe not controversial, but certainly divided. I mean, not everybody was on the same page. I mean, that had changed by the spring of 1776. Well, what we needed was somebody to actually write a formal declaration to our mother country, Great Britain, and tell them that we were no longer going to be a part of their empire. We needed a declaration of independence. Okay? Now, the natural choice, the natural thought anyway, in terms of who's going to write this thing, was John Adams. He had been one of the most outspoken advocates of independence for quite a while. He was a household name as far as most of his colleagues were concerned. Adams didn't want to write it. For a number of different reasons, he didn't want to write it, but one of the reasons he said was he had made himself obnoxious to the Congress in how forceful he was for calling for independence. He says, look, this declaration coming from me, that's not going to be very seriously received by some of these fence-sitters, so we need somebody else. Find somebody else. The next logical choice would have been Benjamin Franklin, who, like Adams, was very well known and very well liked amongst his colleagues, and it just seemed like a natural fit that Franklin was going to do this. Franklin said, no, I don't want to do this either. Right? So the next choice was a guy from Virginia, which is important in and of itself, but Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson was well known, but he didn't say anything. I mean, he never really did anything at these congresses. He pretty much was a bump on a log there. And so anyway, John Adams said, you know what, I really think it should be Jefferson that writes this declaration, and here's why. Number one, he's not from Massachusetts. He's not from the hotbed of all this patriot revolutionary rhetoric, okay? And so it's going to draw Virginia into this conversation. That's important for a lot of different obvious reasons. Number two, and this is probably even more important, Thomas Jefferson, Adams said, was 10 times the writer that I am. I mean, this guy is a writing whiz, and so naturally we should have him write this rather than somebody like me. And so anyway, it's Thomas Jefferson that sits down in his Pennsylvania apartment studio and begins putting pen to paper. And, you think about the language, think about the vocabulary of the Declaration of Independence. We find these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Where is he getting this stuff from? Is he pulling it out of thin air? Of course not. Now, he was influenced by some of the things that had been said in various parts of the country, but later on in his life he admitted that he drew this from the popular sentiments, political sentiments that were swirling around in his day and age. What was swirling around? Enlightenment thought. If you've watched that preparation for the midterm video, you know that I make a really big deal about the Enlightenment for really obvious reasons. No taxation without representation, that's John Locke to a T. But the idea that all men were created equal is really something that is coming out of the Enlightenment. It's coming from people like not only John Locke, but also Voltaire. And these are people that are saying, look, the day and age of the king ruling because of quote-unquote divine intention, because God wanted it that way, that day is over. The day and age of the Pope, telling you how you must see the institution of religion, those days are over. And in the dawn of those days, right, what you're going to see is the democratic era, small d, democratic era. The rule of the people. The king's rule is over, or at least coming to an end, and the rule of the people is beginning. The Middle Ages are ending, and this new democratic era is beginning, okay? So anyway, I need you to understand something really, really directly about the Declaration of Independence. I always see this as sort of a manifestation of all this political thought that had been building for years and years and years and years and years. And while there's other things that it kind of went into it, I mean, you could make a case that there was some Judeo-Christian thought in there, but generally speaking, the Declaration of Independence, what would later become a incredibly important founding document in terms of the American Democratic Republic, was basically drawn from Enlightenment political thought. So I'm hopeful that you can understand how and why it's such an important document with respect to this development of American political thought. If you do understand that, you're going to be doing very well for your essay on the exam. But the other thing that I want to point out as we end here, it's one thing to declare independence, and it's quite another to take on the most powerful country in the world at the time, who, by the way, just got done defeating the second most powerful country in the world at the time. So with all this merrymaking and celebrating and congratulating ourselves and burning effigies of the king, we kind of forgot that we were taking on, the most powerful country in the history of mankind at that point. The point that I'm trying to make right now is that the early days of the American Revolution are going to go very, very poorly for the Americans. And ultimately, there's going to be several key turning points. And I want you to really, really be careful when you listen to my upcoming lectures. Try to find those turning points with respect to the American Revolutionary War. And that's where we'll pick it up next time.